Security had the old man's wheelbarrow halfway to the gate before a single photograph slipped from his shirt pocket and landed face up in the gravel. And the moment Adrian Voss saw the boy in that photograph, he understood, with a horror that emptied his lungs, that he had just ordered his own father dragged off the grounds like garbage. 30 seconds earlier, Adrian had been standing on a temporary stage at the center of Ashgrove Estate, mid-sentence into the biggest product launch of his company's history, when an assistant leaned in to whisper that an unauthorized elderly man had been found tending the East Rose Garden without clearance. Adrian, irritated by the interruption and eager to protect the image of a flawless morning, had given the instruction without a second thought: get him off the property before the cameras notice. He had no idea, in that careless instant, that he had just given the order to remove the one man who had spent 19 years quietly waiting for a chance to simply look at him again. Stay with me, because the photograph that stopped Adrian Voss in his tracks wasn't the end of this story. It was the exact moment a lie his family had maintained for 2 decades finally began to unravel, and by the time it fully came apart, it would cost his uncle everything he had built on top of it. Adrian Voss had grown up believing a version of his childhood that felt, for most of his life, like simple, unremarkable fact. His father, Elias Voss, had been a struggling landscape architect who abandoned the family when Adrian was 7, leaving behind debts, disappointment, and a mother who worked herself into an early grave trying to compensate for his absence. When Adrian's mother died 4 years later, his uncle Desmond Voss, his father's older brother, a shrewd, successful commercial developer, had stepped in without hesitation, raising Adrian in the same sprawling family estate that had once belonged to Adrian's grandfather, providing every material advantage a child could want and steadily, patiently shaping Adrian into the confident, disciplined executive who would eventually take Voss Horticultural Holdings from a modest regional greenhouse supplier to a billion-dollar agritech company spanning 4 continents. Desmond had never spoken warmly of Elias. When Adrian, as a teenager, occasionally asked questions about his absent father, Desmond's answers arrived with the same practiced, measured disappointment every time. Elias had been reckless, unreliable, ultimately unwilling to shoulder the responsibilities of a family, a man who chose his own comfort over his son's stability and never once looked back. Adrian had absorbed that story so thoroughly over so many years that he'd stopped questioning it entirely by the time he reached adulthood, filing his father away as a closed chapter not worth the emotional cost of reopening. What Adrian didn't know, what Desmond had spent 19 years ensuring he would never have reason to question, was that Elias Voss had never abandoned anyone. He had been convicted, when Adrian was 7 years old, of embezzling nearly $300,000 from the family's original landscaping business, a conviction built on financial records that Desmond himself had prepared, timed with surgical precision to arrive just months after their father's death had left the business, and its accompanying inheritance, without a clear line of succession. Elias had served 6 years in prison, protesting his innocence to every lawyer, every parole board, every family member who would listen, none of whom in the end listened for very long. By the time he was released, his wife had died. His son had been fully absorbed into Desmond's household and Desmond's version of events, and every attempt Elias made to reconnect, letters, phone calls, a single desperate visit to the estate gates when Adrian was 15, had been intercepted, denied, or turned away by a household staff working entirely under Desmond's instruction. Elias had eventually stopped trying to force his way back into a life that had been so thoroughly rebuilt around his absence. Instead, roughly 8 years ago, using a different surname and a modest reference from a former cellmate's cousin, he had taken a position as a groundskeeper at Ashgrove Estate itself, the same sprawling property, now serving as Voss Horticultural's flagship demonstration campus, where he had once designed the very rose gardens he now quietly tended close enough, on the days Adrian visited for board meetings and product launches, to occasionally catch a distant glimpse of the son he had never stopped loving, never close enough to be recognized, never bold enough to risk the fragile arrangement that let him remain nearby. He carried every single day of those 8 years, a small weather-proofed photograph in his shirt pocket. Adrian at 6 years old, laughing in that same rose garden, sitting on his father's shoulders, a photograph Elias had kept through 6 years of prison, 3 years of rebuilding, and 8 years of quiet, unacknowledged proximity to the only family he had left. Which was precisely the photograph that fell from his pocket onto the gravel path the morning Adrian Voss, distracted and irritated during the biggest launch event of his career, ordered security to remove an unauthorized elderly man from the East Garden without bothering to ask his name. "Sir, please," Elias said quietly, as two security officers gripped the handles of his wheelbarrow, his voice carrying none of the desperation the moment might have justified. "I only wanted 10 minutes to finish the eastern bed before the guests arrived. I've tended this garden for 8 years. Company policy is clear about unauthorized personnel during launch events," the lead officer replied, already guiding the wheelbarrow toward the perimeter gate. "You'll need to speak with grounds management about proper clearance." It was the photograph slipping loose during that brief scuffle, catching against Elias's sleeve, then falling face up onto the gravel path directly in Adrian's line of sight as he crossed the lawn to address the disruption personally. That stopped everything. Adrian bent down instinctively, some reflexive courtesy overriding his irritation, and picked up the photograph before really registering what he was looking at. Then he stopped moving entirely. The boy in the photograph was unmistakably him, 6 or 7 years old, laughing with an openness Adrian barely recognized in his own adult memory, perched on the shoulders of a man whose face, though younger and less weathered, carried features Adrian had spent 19 years being told he shared with nobody. The same sharp line of the jaw, the same slight asymmetry in the smile. "Where did you get this?" Adrian asked, his voice unsteady in a way that made the security officers instinctively loosen their grip on the wheelbarrow. Elias looked at him for a long moment, weighing, Adrian would later understand, 19 years of caution against a single unrepeatable opportunity. "I've had it since the day it was taken," he said quietly. "In your grandfather's rose garden. You were 6. You wouldn't stop laughing because I kept losing my balance." "That's not possible," Adrian said, though something in his chest had already begun, treacherously, to doubt the certainty in his own voice. "My father left when I was 7. He went to prison for embezzlement. He never—" "I went to prison for a crime I did not commit," Elias interrupted, gently but without hesitation, "for money I never touched, based on records prepared by a man who needed me gone before your grandfather's estate was settled." He held Adrian's gaze steadily. "I have spent 8 years tending this garden because it was the only way your uncle's household would still let me be close enough to occasionally see you cross this lawn. I never stopped trying to reach you, Adrian. I simply ran out of doors that hadn't already been closed." Adrian stood frozen in the middle of his own company's flagship product launch, holding a photograph of a childhood he barely remembered, staring at a groundskeeper his security team had just been ordered to physically remove from the property, and felt the entire, carefully constructed story of his family's history begin to crack open beneath his feet. "Cancel the remainder of the launch," Adrian said finally, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd of investors and journalists who had begun drifting toward the disturbance. "Get him somewhere private. Get me a doctor and get me a lawyer who has never worked for my uncle." Private meeting room inside the Ashgrove Visitor Center was, in ordinary circumstances, used for donor briefings and investor tours, a bright, glass-walled space overlooking the very gardens Elias had spent 8 years tending. Adrian sat across a narrow conference table from the man he'd been told, for 19 years, had abandoned him. Elias sat with the same quiet, careful composure he'd maintained since the wheelbarrow incident, his weathered hands folded in his lap, waiting. "If this is true," Adrian said slowly, still holding the photograph, "why didn't you ever try harder? 19 years, and you just accepted watching me from a garden bed?" "I tried everything available to a man with a felony conviction and no money," Elias replied, without defensiveness. "Letters returned unopened. Phone calls that never reached past your uncle's assistant. One visit to the estate gates when you were 15, where I was told in front of you that I was a stranger trespassing on private property, and you looked at me the way a stranger deserves to be looked at, because that's exactly what 19 years of careful storytelling had made me to you." He paused. "I decided after that forcing my way into your life would only hurt you further. Staying close enough to occasionally see you, even as a man who cuts your roses rather than a man who raised you, was the only version of nearness I still had access to." Adrian's throat tightened at a memory he'd buried for over a decade, A strange, unsettling encounter at the estate gates when he was 15. An older man his uncle had dismissed sharply as a disturbed trespasser, an encounter Adrian had never thought about again until this exact moment. "I remember that day," Adrian said quietly. "I remember thinking you looked at me like you knew me." "I did know you," Elias said. "I still do, more than the 8 years of distance should have allowed. You still bite the inside of your cheek when you're concentrating. You did it just now, reading this photograph." Adrian's hand rose unconsciously to his own jaw. He set the photograph down carefully on the table between them. "I need proof," he said, his voice rough. "Not because I don't believe you. Because if what you're telling me is true, it means my uncle built 19 years of my life on a lie sophisticated enough to survive a criminal trial. I need something that can survive scrutiny beyond this room." "Then get your test," Elias said simply. "I have been waiting 19 years for someone to finally ask the right question. I can wait a few more days for the answer." The paternity results, expedited through an independent laboratory Adrian selected specifically outside his uncle's extensive professional network, confirmed what the photograph had already made undeniable. Better than 99.9% probability that Elias Voss was Adrian's biological father. But it was the second investigation Adrian quietly commissioned, a forensic review of the original embezzlement case, conducted by a retired appellate attorney with no prior connection to the Voss family or its businesses, that ultimately exposed the full architecture of what Desmond had built. The retired attorney, a meticulous woman named Constance Fairweather, began with the simplest possible question. Who had prepared the financial records that formed the basis of Elias's original conviction? The answer, buried in 19-year-old court filings that had never been seriously challenged during the original trial, led directly back to Desmond Voss himself, who had served at the time as the family landscaping business's interim financial officer during a period when Elias, then the company's lead designer, not its accountant, had virtually no oversight authority over the very transactions he was later convicted of orchestrating. "The forensic accountant who testified against your father in the original trial," Constance told Adrian during their first full briefing, sliding a folder of aging financial documents across his desk, "worked directly for your uncle's holding company for 6 years both before and after your father's conviction. That relationship was never disclosed to the original jury. On its own, that's a serious ethical problem. Combined with the timing, your father convicted 8 months after your grandfather's death, precisely as the estate's succession was being finalized, it starts to look considerably less like a conviction and considerably more like a mechanism." "A mechanism for what?" Adrian asked, though some part of him had already anticipated the answer with a sick, sinking certainty. "For removing the one sibling who stood between your uncle and full, uncontested control of your grandfather's company," Constance said. "Your father held a 40% stake in the original business, inherited jointly with your uncle. A criminal conviction, particularly one involving financial impropriety, gave the estate's executors sufficient grounds to liquidate his shares entirely in the interest of protecting company assets from further mismanagement. Your uncle acquired those shares at a steep discount less than a year after the conviction. That acquisition became the foundation of everything Voss Horticultural has built since." Adrian sat with that revelation for a long moment, watching 19 years of assumed history rearrange itself around a considerably darker architecture than simple abandonment. "He didn't just take my father's freedom," Adrian said finally. "He took his company. And then he took me and raised me inside the story that made it look like justice instead of theft." Desmond Voss, once formally confronted with Constance's findings during a meeting Adrian arranged at the family estate's original study, responded with the same practiced, unruffled composure that had carried him through 3 decades of careful reputation management. "You're allowing a convicted felon's sudden reappearance to destabilize a company I built from nothing after your father's negligence nearly destroyed it," Desmond said, settling into the leather armchair that had once belonged to Adrian's grandfather. "I understand the emotional appeal of a sympathetic groundskeeper claiming victimhood, Adrian. But sentiment isn't evidence. The financial officer who built the case against him worked for you for 6 years," Adrian said, placing Constance's report on the desk between them. You liquidated his shares within a year at a steep discount to yourself. You intercepted his letters for over a decade. None of that requires sentiment to establish, Uncle Desmond. It requires reading the documents you apparently assumed no one would ever look at closely again. I protected this family's business from a man who had already proven himself unreliable with money and responsibility, Desmond replied, his composure beginning for the first time to show genuine strain. Whatever technical irregularities existed in the original case, the outcome was correct. Look at what this company has become under careful, disciplined leadership. Look at what you have become because I raised you rather than a man who was, by every available account at the time, a failure. You didn't raise me instead of a failure, Adrian said, his voice steady despite the anger building beneath it. You raised me instead of my father because removing him was more profitable than allowing him to remain part of a company he co-owned. And then you spent 19 years making sure I believed the theft was actually rescue. The formal reckoning unfolded over the following months with the same institutional thoroughness that had characterized Desmond's original scheme. Constance's forensic findings, combined with a re-examination of the original financial testimony that revealed clear conflicts of interest never disclosed to the trial jury, formed the basis of a formal appeal that ultimately succeeded in vacating Elias's decades-old conviction, not through any dramatic courtroom confession but through the patient, methodical dismantling of evidence that had simply never been rigorously tested the first time. Desmond, facing both the vacated criminal case and a shareholder lawsuit Adrian authorized once the board's independent directors reviewed Constance's full report, was removed from Voss Horticultural's board within the month, the company's disclosure filings citing material findings regarding historical conflicts of interest and undisclosed related party transactions with the same careful, sanitized language corporate boards typically use to avoid the messier truth underneath. Company's flagship gardens at Ashgrove, once merely a decorative backdrop for investor events, became the site of a considerably more meaningful transformation. Adrian appointed Elias, reinstated fully under his own name, his original landscape architecture credentials formally recognized once his conviction was vacated, as the estate's head of horticultural design, not as a symbolic gesture, but because Elias's decades of quiet, careful attention to the property's rose gardens had, Adrian came to recognize, produced work of a caliber the company's other properties had never matched. You could have simply given me the position, Elias told Adrian. Several months into the new arrangement, the two of them walking together through the eastern beds Elias had tended anonymously for 8 years. You didn't need the board to formally review my design portfolio first. I know, Adrian said, but I think you'd have refused it if I offered it as charity rather than earned recognition. Wouldn't you? Elias considered the question with a faint, genuine smile. You're beginning to know me rather well for someone who spent 8 years walking past me without recognition. I'm trying to make up for lost time, Adrian said, though I understand now that some of it simply can't be recovered. I lost 15 years believing you chose to leave. That's not something a reinstated job title fixes. No, Elias agreed. But it's not nothing either. Pair rarely restores what was taken. It simply builds something worth having going forward. Their relationship in the months that followed developed with the careful, unhurried pacing of two people relearning each other after 19 years of enforced distance. Weekly dinners that gradually shed their initial awkwardness, Adrian's slow rediscovery of small specific memories he'd buried rather than lost, Elias's cautious willingness to finally speak openly about the 6 years he'd spent in prison protesting an innocence nobody had wanted to hear. Adrian used the settlement recovered from the shareholder litigation against Desmond, along with a formal restitution order tied to the vacated conviction, to establish the Fairweather Voss Fund, named jointly for the attorney who had uncovered the truth and the father it had ultimately restored, a foundation dedicated to funding wrongful conviction appeals for defendants who, like Elias, lacked the resources to challenge convictions built on undisclosed conflicts of interest. I don't want this named after me alone, Elias told Adrian, when the Foundation's charter was first presented for his approval. There were other men in that prison who never got a groundskeeping job or a son with the resources to hire Constance Fairweather. Name it after the work, not just my story. It's named after both, Adrian said. Because your story is the reason the work exists at all. A year after the photograph fell into the gravel path outside Ashgrove's East Garden, Adrian stood beside his father at the Foundation's first annual review, watching a slideshow of 5 successful wrongful conviction appeals the fund had helped finance in its opening 12 months. 5 men, none of them connected to the Voss family, whose convictions had been vacated through the same patient, evidence-driven process that had finally freed Elias's own record from the lie his brother had built into it. Your uncle used to say that careful, disciplined control was the foundation of everything worth building, Elias observed quietly, watching the final slide fade to the Foundation's simple logo. I've come to think he had the principle right and the target wrong. Discipline built on someone else's stolen freedom isn't foundation. It's theft wearing a suit. Adrian looked at his father, older now, weathered by decades the lie had cost him, but steady in a way 19 years of quiet gardening had apparently never managed to erode, and felt, for the first time since a photograph had fallen face up onto a gravel path, that the story he'd spent his whole life believing had finally fully been replaced with one he could trust. I ordered security to remove you, Adrian said, the memory still carrying a specific, particular shame he suspected would never fully fade. The first time I had the chance to actually see you in 19 years, and my first instinct was to have you dragged off my own property. You didn't know me, Elias said simply. A man can't be blamed for failing to recognize what he was never shown. What matters is what you did the moment the photograph gave you a reason to look twice. He placed a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. You looked twice, Adrian. That's more than 19 years of careful lying ever gave you the chance to do before. Thank you so much for staying with this story until the very end. If Adrian and Elias's journey from a security confrontation to a hard-won reunion moved you, let me know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories about hidden truths, wrongful convictions finally overturned, and families finding their way back to each other against every odd, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder that the truth, however delayed, eventually finds its way home. What would you have done in Adrian's position? Tell me below.